Hello, my name is Florian Aupetit, I am Lighting Supervisor at Spa Studio, and in this video I will describe the process of making a lighting shot during the production of Klaus. To give you an estimation of how long it took for the artist to do that shot, I sped up the time-lapse roughly around 20 times to have a video of 20 minutes. So it took something like 6 to 7 hours, so basically a day of work, for the artist to lead that shot. So let's check it. Okay, so the first thing the artist is doing is to set up the color palette of the shot. Based on other shots from the sequence, you can see on the top right that he is picking the colors for the shadow and the light, but also for the two SSS component. It's basically the transition between light and shadow. And finally the color for the ambient light. Before starting, the artist would check the color keys of the sequence, and if needed they would have a briefing for myself. And because in this shot Klaus is standing in the shadow with just a warm and bright rim light, the best way to get the volumes on him is to use the ambient light. So you can see in the panel below the colors that he's starting with the ambient light on the beard, and the first thing he's doing is to look for the top planes of the beard. Then right after he's creating a layer called value hair, and you will see this kind of layer pretty often in the video to control the global opacity of the ambient light on the beard. So at first glance the beard can be tricky to shade, but once you understand the structure of how it's built, then it's fairly easy to do. So here is a wireframe and a breakdown I did for my team, so they can understand better the structure of it. So as you can see, he keeps adding different shapes on all the top planes of the beard, and refining here and there, especially the feather of the shapes. When you shade a character, controlling the edges is something very important, because if you soften your edges too much, you can quickly get a kind of airbrushy effect, and that was something we really wanted to avoid on Klaus. Now he's jumping on the mustache, and it's probably too fast, but sometimes you can see a black screen with big shapes, and this is basically the way we assign to the layer the boundaries of the area we want to work on, and in this case the mustache. So again, he's looking for the top planes, and sometimes when it's needed, he creates shapes to subtract the ambient light, for example under the nose. After that, he's going to work on the face, and the face is probably the most important part of the character to shade, because that's where most of the emotion comes from, and especially on a character like Klaus, where he's not overacting like Jesper in the movie. His emotion and acting are translated through really subtle animation in this face. So the main features we would be looking for on Klaus' face would be the two top plates of the nose, plus the nostrils, the eye bags, and the forehead. Also, you probably noticed it, but since the face is symmetrical, there is no need to redo the shapes another time, the one of the eye bag. So we just duplicate it and flip it horizontally, and you just need to adjust it to the perspective. And to finish the part of the face, he's creating a shape for the mouth and adding one to subtract the part that is occluded by the mustache. Okay, so it was pretty fast, but if you missed it, he just went at the end of the timeline to adjust all the shapes he just created. And because the first and last pose are not so different, plus the fact that the animation is pretty slow, for most of the lighting components, he will mainly just need 2, maybe 3 keys, one at the beginning and one at the end. Except for some elements like the mouth or the eyes, he will have to add more keys in between, but that's not really a big problem. There are 2 ways to animate the shapes. The first one is to do it manually. That means you create your shape, let's say on frame 1, then you go on frame 10 and you adjust it by hand. And you do that again and again. The second option, when you have an easy shot like this, is to ask Klaus, the program, to guess with the tracking system where and what shape your actual shape will have at that frame of the timeline. And that's what he did in this case. So practically speaking, he just went at the end of the timeline, because again it's an easy shot. He used the shortcut to guess where the shape should be, and if needed he can adjust them. The fix on the mouth here is a good example of what I just explained before, and this kind of work is of course the most time consuming for us. In this case it's fairly easy and fast, but now you know how it works, I invite you to watch Klaus again and pay attention to this kind of details, especially the hands, and even more specifically if you want, Jesper's hands. Because like Italians for example, Jesper speaks a lot with his hands, and that's really cool, but of course it implies more work from our side. So now you can see he's adjusting the shapes for the ambient light on the eyebrows. And actually it reminds me to tell you that for this kind of lighting work, your technical skills in a software like Photoshop, Painter, Procreate or whatever is not what we are looking for. We were looking for artists with a good sense of volume and lighting of course. But if you're a traditional painter, as long as you know how to use a computer, then it would be fine. Because learning class is pretty fast, and with the French studio Les Films du Poisson Rouge, who developed Klaus, we try to make it as simple as possible for the artist who will use it. So yeah, keep that in mind if you want to apply. Now we just created a big shape with lots of feather to apply ambient light on the shoulders and the shoulder pads. And there is something interesting to notice, and that's what I call the shape economy, because as you can see he's creating a second shape to subtract the ambient light. And with this shape he will do the form shadow on the pad, but also the cast shadow on the shoulders at the same time. And that's something we had to keep in mind during the production of Klaus, because if an artist is using 15 shapes to do the shadow of the nose, and then I ask him or her to change it, then it will take forever to find the problematic one, while with only one shape you can just move the points and that's all. Of course, in some cases you cannot avoid creating lots of shapes, but for the sake of everyone in the team, it was better to do a good lighting with less shapes. So now we jumped from the ambient light to translucent component. And that's a bit tricky and not really intuitive, because for what he's doing now, theoretically, he should use the occlusion component. But that's something we learned during the production of Klaus, because the blending mode of occlusion is multiply. In some cases it would create a kind of dirty effect on the character, so if they are not used somewhere else in the shot, then we would use a different component to do the occlusion, like translucent in this case, but it could also be custom, to have deeper colors in those areas and not like a very dark, almost black feeling. So we are using the occlusion to create, or at least give the illusion of contact between two objects. And in this case you can see that he's adding a couple of shapes at the tip of the beard strands to create that contact between the beard and the chest, but also between the strands itself. Then again, he is going at the end of the timeline, guess the position of the shapes with the software and adjusting them. Also, maybe sometimes you can see 4 white squares around the shapes, and that's a very useful tool we had. It's basically a 4-corner pin warp tool, the same you're using in Photoshop. So it was really useful to just distort the shapes and not drawing it over or just move some vertex. Now that the ambient light and occlusion pass are done, he will add the bounce light coming from the ground. And for that he's picking a dark orange with a low level of saturation. Depending on the shot and the lighting condition, of course, the artist will use either the secondary light component or the rim light to create that bounce light. The final effect will be slightly different due to the blending mode of those components, so again, it was a very organic process. And you can see that now, unlike for the ambient light, where he was looking for all the top planes of the beard, he's now looking for all the planes facing the ground to add that bounce light. After the beard, he's now working on the face. Again, same technique. Instead of controlling the opacity of each shapes of this layer, he will create a master layer on top of it called value skin, to only have one shape to manage for the whole opacity of the bounce light of the face. And it was very nice to shade Klaus's face, because in a way it was very blocky, very sculpted. So it was pretty easy to understand the volume of his face. So we could use some prominent features like the part of the eyebrows and the eye sockets, or the nose, or even the eye bags, using some like croissant shapes to shade them properly. Now you can see that he's creating a big shape with lots of feather, and that's to fake the fall-off of the light. And by fall-off I mean the attenuation of the intensity of the light, so the intensity is higher on the bottom part of the beard, and the more you go closer to the face, the dimmer the bounce light will be. As you can see, he went again at the end of the timeline and guessed the position of the shapes. And because the movement is pretty subtle, he doesn't even need to tweak the position of each shapes. So for the eyes, he's just using a big and simple gradient with a low opacity, and then he will duplicate and flip it for the eye on the right. He will also add a spot of highlight, but later you will see that he will copy it to the specular component. And the teeth are a pretty good example of the attention to details we wanted to have on Klaus. Because we could have let them flat, but I think by shading them it makes the character more believable in a way. So it's a pretty cool touch, I think. Finally, he's working on the component of light that bring the dynamic of the light in the scene, and that's the rim light. And like for the translucency in the ears, for example, rim light is always a pretty nice part to work on. Something very important in a visual point of view when the artist is working on the rim light is to control the thickness of it. Because we wanted to avoid the rim light with the same thickness all along the edge. It's kind of boring and not pleasing for the eyes. So you can see that he's playing with the thick and thin part to keep that dynamic effect. The last touch is to add two big shapes that will subtract the rim light on the shoulders with a big gradient, and that's how it looks at the end in the movie.
Wait, don't touch that!
Impeccably organized for you!
No!
What's this? Klaus, I'm sorry. I didn't mean...
Get out!